The first time the sky turned green, only one person in prosperity understood what it meant. Analise Harper stood alone on a rise of dry Nebraska land, her hands buried deep in the soil, while the town behind her laughed. The summer heat pressed down like a heavy blanket. The prairie stretched endless and flat in every direction, a sea of grass beneath a sky so wide it felt cruel. The sun burned without mercy. Even the wind felt hot and sharp, carrying dust that scratched the skin and filled the mouth with grit. Analise did not look toward the town. She knelt on the patch of land that was now hers and pushed her fingers into the earth. On the surface it was dry and cracked, but beneath it was cool and firm. She lifted a handful and crushed it slowly. It held together. It had strength. Her dog, Boulder, lay close beside her, his dark fur rising and falling with slow breaths. His amber eyes never left her face. He did not question her. He did not doubt her. He simply stayed. Back east, fever had taken everything from her. Her husband, her home, her past. What remained was a folded deed in her dress pocket in this stretch of prairie land that no one else wanted. In town, hammers rang from morning to night. Tall wooden houses rose from the flat ground, built from pine hauled in from faraway forests. The men of prosperity built high and proud, their walls straight and sharp against the sky. They believed height meant strength. They believed wood meant progress. Analise believed something else. Her grandfather had once told her that the prairie was not an enemy. It was older than any town, stronger than any man. You do not fight the land, he had said. You listen to it. So she did not build upward. She built down. She marked the shape of her home in the earth and began to dig into the slope of the rise. The work was slow and heavy. Each cut of the spade took effort. Each lift of soil burned her arms. Sweat ran down her back and soaked into her dress. The sun baked her skin red. She sliced thick sections of prairie sod, keeping the grass roots intact. The roots were woven tight and strong, binding the soil together like cloth. These blocks of earth became her bricks. She stacked them carefully, pressing them into place with steady hands. From a distance, riders slowed to stare. They saw a woman digging into the ground like an animal. They did not see a house forming. Mrs. Gable was the first to speak the words out loud. She stood outside the general store one afternoon, her hands folded tight at her waist, her voice carrying across the wooden porch. "That widow is building herself a dirt hole," she said, her tone sharp, like some kind of prairie rat. The women around her nodded. Some laughed. Others shook their heads with false pity. The name spread quickly. The Dirt House. Men began riding out on Sundays just to see it. They claimed they were hunting, but they were not carrying meat back. They stood at a distance and stared at the low walls slowly rising from the ground. They pointed. They smirked. Analise kept working. Her house took shape as a dugout pressed into the earth. The back wall was the hill itself. The sides were thick with layered sod. The roof sloped low and was covered again with living prairie grass so that, from afar, it almost disappeared. Inside, the air was cool, even in the heat of day. The walls held the earth's damp breath. The wind that howled across the plains barely whispered within. But the town saw only mud. One afternoon, Mr. Henry Sterling rode out to her land. He was the banker who had financed most of Prosperity's buildings. His horse was well-groomed. His boots shone. He removed his hat politely, though his eyes held doubt. "Miss Harper," he said in a calm voice, "the town is concerned. A woman alone should not live like this. We can arrange lumber, proper framing. I can approve a loan." Analise paused with a block of sod in her hands. She met his eyes without anger. "My home is already framed," she said quietly. He looked around at the packed earth and frowned. "This is not civilized," he replied. She set the sod into place, pressing it firm against the others. "It is safe," she answered. Mr. Sterling shook his head. He warned her gently that storms came fast on the prairie, that wood stood strong, that her dirt walls would fail. She thanked him for his concern. He rode away unconvinced. After that visit, the silence in town grew colder. When Analise walked into Prosperity for flour or salt, conversations stopped. Mothers pulled children close. Mrs. Gable watched her from the porch of the mercantile with tight lips and narrow eyes. Only one person offered her anything different. Old Martha Reed, who had lived on the plains longer than anyone else, would sit on a bench outside her small cabin at the edge of town. When Analise passed, Martha gave her a slow nod. It was a quiet sign of respect. Summer deepened. The heat thickened. The sky began to change. At dawn and dusk, strange colors spread along the horizon. Yellow mixed with purple in a way that made the land look wounded. The air felt heavy and still, as if the world were holding its breath. Analise felt the shift in her bones. Boulder grew restless. He stayed close to the doorway of the dugout, whining softly at sounds no one else seemed to hear. In town, preparations were underway for Founders' Day. The new two-story town hall stood tall and proud at the center of Prosperity. Mr. Sterling gave speeches about growth and permanence. Laughter filled the streets in the evenings. No one noticed the way the birds had gone quiet. No one noticed how the grass stood still without wind. No one noticed the thin, dark line gathering low in the western sky. Analise noticed. She reinforced her roof with more packed earth. She checked the wooden door. She sealed the small windows tight. She moved her few belongings deeper inside. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down like a warning. On the morning of Founders' Day, the sky was the color of dull brass. The light felt wrong. The wind had vanished completely. Prosperity gathered in the square with blankets and baskets. Children ran between the wooden buildings. Laughter rang loud in the strange silence. Analise stood outside her dirt house and watched the western horizon. The dark line of clouds had grown taller. The prairie was breathing in, and it had not yet begun to exhale. By mid-afternoon, the air in Prosperity felt thick enough to choke a man. The picnic tables stood heavy with food. Children chased each other between the wooden buildings. Women fanned themselves with folded paper. The men spoke loudly about crops and cattle, about profit and plans for the coming winter. Laughter rose into the strange yellow sky, but it sounded hollow, like it did not belong there. No wind moved across the square. Not a single leaf stirred. Old Martha Reed was the first to leave the gathering. She looked west, her lined face tightening. Without a word, she turned and walked slowly toward the edge of town. A few people noticed her, but no one followed. Mr. Sterling stood near the new town hall, proud and smiling. The tall wooden building cast a long shadow across the dirt street. Its sharp roof pointed boldly at the sky, as if daring it to strike. Far out on her rise, Analise felt the ground change beneath her boots. It was not a sound at first. It was a pressure, a weight in the air that pressed against her ears and chest. Boulder lifted his head sharply and let out a low growl. His fur bristled along his spine. The sky darkened in a way that did not look natural. The green tint deepened. The light grew dim, though the sun had not yet set. Clouds stacked high and thick on the western horizon, climbing upward like a wall of smoke. They twisted and rolled inside themselves. Analise stepped inside her dugout and checked the door one last time. She dropped the wooden bar into place and sealed it tight. The air inside was cool and steady. The earth walls felt solid beneath her palms. Outside, the first distant rumble rolled across the plains. It was not thunder. It was lower, longer. It felt alive. In the town square, the music stopped. Heads turned west. The cloud wall had grown massive. It swallowed the sunlight in slow motion. The horizon vanished beneath a moving black curtain. The temperature dropped sharply, and a cold wind rushed in from nowhere. Blankets lifted into the air. Baskets tipped. Children began to cry. Someone shouted to run. The first blast of wind hit like a hammer. It tore hats from heads and knocked people sideways. Dust exploded upward from the ground. The sky above churned like boiling water. Then they saw it. From the belly of the storm, a thin, dark funnel stretched downward. It twisted violently, touching the prairie miles away. At first it looked small, harmless. Then it began to widen. The roar grew louder. It rolled forward across the land like an approaching train. The ground trembled underfoot. Windows shattered before the funnel even reached the edge of town. Panic took over. Men grabbed their wives. Mothers screamed for their children. People ran toward their houses, believing walls would protect them. Mr. Sterling shouted orders no one could hear. The roar swallowed every voice. The funnel reached prosperity. It struck the outer barns first. Wood splintered into flying shards. Roofs lifted into the air as if they weighed nothing. The church steeple snapped and vanished into the spinning cloud. Inside her dugout, Analise pressed her back against the earth wall and pulled Boulder close. The roar outside became deafening. The ground shook hard enough to rattle her teeth. Dust fell from the ceiling, but the walls held firm. She could hear the sound of destruction through the thick earth. Wood breaking, glass exploding, beams ripping apart. The wind screamed like a living creature in pain. The air pressure dropped so fast her ears rang sharply. Boulder whimpered but did not try to flee. He pressed himself into her legs and trembled. Above them the storm passed over. The earth roof absorbed the fury. The wind slid across the grass-covered mound without catching. There were no tall walls to tear away, no sharp edges to grab. The roar continued for long, endless minutes. Then, as suddenly as it began, it moved on. The sound faded eastward across the plains. The trembling stopped. The air grew still once more. Silence fell. It was heavier than the storm. Analise did not move at first. She waited. She listened to the faint drip of rain on sod. She felt the steady coolness of the earth around her. When she was sure the danger had passed, she lifted the wooden bar and pushed the door open slowly. Light poured in. The world outside looked wrong. The rise where she stood was untouched. The wild grass on her roof lay flattened but intact. The soil walls stood solid and unmoved. Beyond her hill, where prosperity had stood, there was nothing but wreckage. Wood lay scattered across the prairie like broken matchsticks. Whole houses were gone, reduced to piles of splintered beams. The proud town hall was a shattered frame twisted into the mud. Wagons lay overturned. Fences were erased. Smoke drifted from small fires. Rainwater pooled in deep gouges torn into the ground. No building stood. Not one. Analise stepped forward slowly, Boulder at her side. The wind now carried only the smell of wet earth and fresh broken wood. Movement stirred among the debris. Figures crawled from ditches and from beneath collapsed boards. Men staggered upright, bleeding and stunned. Women clutched crying children. Faces were pale and covered in mud. They looked around in disbelief. Their town was gone. Then, one by one, their eyes lifted toward the rise. They saw her. They saw the low mound of earth that had once been the object of their laughter. They saw the only home left standing. Mr. Sterling stumbled through the wreckage, his fine coat torn and his arm hanging useless at his side. His face was gray with shock. He stared at the intact dugout as if it were something impossible. Mrs. Gable stood nearby, her hair loose and her dress ripped. Her expression held no pride now, only fear. The wind whispered through the prairie grass. The dirt house stood quiet and firm against the hill, and for the first time no one was laughing. For several long moments, no one moved toward the rise. The survivors stood scattered among the wreckage, staring at the low mound of earth as if it were something holy and strange. Smoke drifted in thin gray lines across the torn prairie. The sky above was clearing, pale and empty again, as if nothing had happened. Mr. Sterling was the first to take a step. He walked slowly, unsteady on his feet, his broken pride heavier than his injured arm. Each step carried him away from the ruins of his grand wooden buildings and toward the quiet shelter he had once called foolish. Behind him, others followed. Mrs. Gable clutched a child who was not her own. A farmer limped with blood running down his forehead. Two young boys walked side by side in silence, their eyes wide and lost. They moved together without speaking, drawn by the only structure that had survived. Analise stood outside her door, Boulder close at her side. She did not smile. She did not speak at first. She looked at their faces and saw not enemies, but people broken open by something far greater than pride. Mr. Sterling stopped a few feet from her. "It's standing," he said quietly, as if he still could not believe it. His voice no longer carried authority. It carried disbelief. Analise nodded once. "Yes," she said. He looked back over his shoulder at the ruins of prosperity. The town hall lay in pieces. The church bell rested, half buried in mud. The homes he had financed, the homes he had called strong, were scattered across the fields like straw. "We built high," he murmured. "We thought that meant safe." Analise said nothing. The wind moved gently now, brushing across the prairie grass that covered her roof. It made a soft whispering sound, calm and steady. Mrs. Gable stepped forward next. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The sharp judgment that once filled her eyes was gone. Analise looked at them all and felt no triumph, only sorrow. "There is room," she said softly. She stepped aside and opened the door wide. One by one they entered. Inside, the air was cool and grounded. The thick earth walls held steady. The smell of soil and drying herbs wrapped around them like a blanket. The sound of the wind outside was muted to a distant hush. The survivors sat on the packed dirt floor, leaning against the walls. Some wept quietly. Others stared forward in silence, trying to understand how everything could vanish in a single hour. A small boy ran his fingers along the wall. "It's strong," he whispered. Analise knelt beside him and placed her hand flat against the earth. "It listens," she said. Mr. Sterling lowered himself carefully near the doorway. His face looked older than it had that morning. The confidence that once filled his posture was gone. "You knew," he said to her. "You saw it coming." Analise looked toward the small window, where a thin beam of sunlight now entered. "My grandfather taught me to watch the sky," she replied, "and to watch the land even more." Outside, faint cries drifted across the prairie. Others had survived, scattered across the fields and ditches. Slowly, small groups began making their way toward the rise. They came without laughter, without pride. They came seeking shelter. Through the evening, the dirt house filled with quiet breathing and soft voices. Analise shared what little food she had. Water was passed carefully from hand to hand. Boulder lay near the entrance, calm now, as if he had always known this would be the outcome. As the sun lowered, the full shape of destruction became clear. Where prosperity had stood proud and loud, there was now only open land. The town had been erased as cleanly as if it had never existed. The survivors stepped outside in the fading light. They walked slowly among the ruins, gathering what could be saved. A blanket here, a tin cup there, the remains of a photograph. Each object felt small and fragile against the vast empty prairie. Mr. Sterling stood in the center of what had once been Main Street. He turned slowly in a full circle. "There is nothing left," he said. Old Martha Reed approached him, her face steady. "There is," she replied, nodding toward the rise. He followed her gaze. The dirt house rested quietly against the hill, part of the land itself. It did not rise tall. It did not demand attention. It simply endured. That night, many slept inside its walls. Others slept nearby, close enough to feel its presence. No one spoke of loans. No one spoke of progress. They spoke only of survival. In the darkness, Mr. Sterling sat awake for a long time. He listened to the wind move softly over the earth roof. He pressed his palm against the cool wall beside him. For the first time in his life, he understood that strength was not always found in what stood tallest. Across the room, Analise sat quietly, her back against the earth that had sheltered her. She did not feel vindicated. She felt the weight of responsibility. The storm had not only destroyed a town, it had stripped away illusion. Morning would come, and with it, a choice. Rebuild as before, or rebuild differently. Morning rose slowly over the prairie, pale and quiet. Where houses had once stood, there were only open scars in the earth. The sun revealed the full truth of the storm. Splintered beams lay scattered for miles. Pieces of furniture were lodged in trees. The town hall that had once towered over Main Street was nothing more than broken timber pressed into the mud. The silence felt heavy. People moved carefully through the wreckage, speaking in low voices. No one laughed. No one boasted. They searched for what little could be saved and carried it toward the rise where Annalise's home stood steady against the hill. Mr. Sterling walked beside her that morning. His arm was bound tightly in cloth. He looked smaller somehow, as if the storm had carved away something inside him. "We were wrong," he said plainly. Analise did not answer right away. She watched a group of men attempt to lift a fallen beam. It snapped easily in their hands. "We thought strong meant tall," he continued. "We thought cost meant safety." She turned to him. "The prairie does not care what we think," she said. He nodded once. By noon, a circle of townspeople had gathered near the rise. They stood facing Annalise, not with mockery, but with quiet expectation. Even Mrs. Gable stood among them, her once proud posture softened by grief. Old Martha Reed stepped forward. "Show us," she said. There was no demand in her voice, only respect. Annalise looked at the faces before her. Men who had laughed at her, women who had whispered about her, children who had stared. Now their expressions held something new. Humility. She walked to the edge of her dugout and pressed her hand against the earth. "You build with the land," she began, "not against it." She showed them how she had chosen the slope of the rise so the wind would pass over instead of striking flat walls. She explained how thick sod blocks held together because of their woven roots. She showed them how the roof was not separate from the ground but part of it. The men listened without interruption. She handed Mr. Sterling her spade. He hesitated only a moment before pushing it into the soil. The work began. There were no tall frames rising this time, no sharp wooden edges pointing at the sky. Instead, the people of prosperity dug downward. They cut thick squares of sod. They stacked them tightly. They packed earth into every gap. The rhythm of digging replaced the sound of hammers. Days passed. Hands blistered. Backs ached. Sweat-soaked clothing once again. But this time, there was no laughter from a distance. They worked side by side, united by what they had seen. Mrs. Gable knelt beside Annalise one afternoon, pressing a block of sod firmly into place. "I was cruel," she said softly without looking up. Annalise paused. "The storm was cruel," she replied. Mrs. Gable swallowed and nodded. That was enough. Children carried water. Men hauled soil. Women shaped the walls smooth and strong. The rise that once held only one dirt house now slowly filled with low-earth homes that blended into the prairie itself. Mr. Sterling changed more than anyone. He stopped speaking of loans for tall wooden buildings. Instead, he used his resources to gather tools and help organize the work. He made sure widows and injured families were given help first. His pride had been replaced with purpose. At sunset each evening, the town would pause and look west. They watched the sky differently now. They studied its colors. They listened for shifts in wind. They remembered the sound of that roar. Fear had not vanished. It had become wisdom. Weeks later, the first new row of earth homes stood complete. They were not grand. They did not tower. But they were thick, steady, and quiet. Prosperity began to rise again, though it no longer rose high. It grew low and wide, hugging the land like a part of it. Visitors who passed through later that year would often slow their horses, confused by the sight. The town seemed to emerge from the prairie itself, as if it had grown naturally from the soil. And at the center of it all stood Annalise's original dirt house. No longer a symbol of mockery, now a model. One evening, Mr. Sterling approached her as she sat outside, Boulder resting at her feet. "You saved us," he said. She shook her head gently. "The land saved us," she replied. "We just learned to listen." The wind moved softly across the grass roof above them. In the fading light, the new prosperity looked nothing like the old one. And that was the point. The first winter after the storm came early. Cold winds swept across the Nebraska plains, sharp and steady. Frost covered the prairie each morning, turning the grass white beneath the pale sun. Smoke rose in thin, quiet lines from the low-earth homes that now dotted the rise. Inside those homes, families slept warm. The thick, sod walls held the heat close. The roofs, packed deep with earth and grass, did not rattle when the wind passed. There were no sharp corners for the storm to grab, no tall boards to rip away. The town that once stood high now rested close to the land. Prosperity had changed. People moved differently. They spoke differently. When the western sky darkened even slightly, conversations paused. Eyes lifted. The memory of the green sky of 1885 lived in every mind. Mr. Sterling kept his promise. He made sure the new schoolhouse was built low and strong, partly set into the ground. He stood beside the men as they worked, his once spotless coat replaced with worn sleeves rolled high. He no longer spoke of dominance over the prairie. He spoke of partnership. Mrs. Gable changed as well. She no longer stood on the porch to whisper about others. She spent her days helping families who had lost the most. When newcomers arrived, she told them the story of the storm without pride or shame. She pointed toward the rise and said, "That house taught us." Annalise never sought attention. She continued tending her small patch of land. She planted herbs near the entrance of her home. She walked the prairie with Boulder each evening, studying the grass and sky the way her grandfather once had. But people came to her. They came quietly at first. A farmer wanting advice about building into a hillside. A young couple asking how to cut sod blocks so they would not crumble. A mother wanting to know how to seal her door tight against winter wind. Annalise showed them patiently. She explained how roots held the soil together, how walls should lean slightly inward for strength, how roofs should slope gently so the wind would glide over instead of collide. Her words were simple. Her lessons were steady. Years passed. Children who had survived the tornado grew into adults who no longer mocked the earth. They built with it from the beginning. They taught their own children to watch the western horizon with respect. Prosperity became known not for its tall buildings, but for its resilience. Travelers who stopped there would hear the story of the great storm. They would stand on the rise and look across the low homes blending into the prairie. They would see how the town seemed less like something built and more like something grown. At the center remained the original dirt house. Grass still covered its roof. Wildflowers bloomed there in spring. It did not look impressive. It did not look grand, but it endured. One late summer evening, many years after the storm, Mr. Sterling sat beside Annalise outside her home. His hair had turned gray. His voice had softened with age. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, "staying alone out here when we all turned our backs on you?" Annalise watched the sun dip low across the plains. Boulder, older now, rested his head on her boot. "I was never alone," she said quietly. "The land was always here." The prairie stretched endless and calm beneath a wide open sky. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the steady whisper of earth that had seen storms long before towns existed. Prosperity no longer tried to rise above that land. It lived within it, and whenever the sky turned strange at dusk, whenever the air grew thick and still, the people remembered the lesson written into the soil itself. True strength is not found in standing tallest. It is found in knowing when to lie low and hold fast. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes strength means standing high, and follow for more stories of courage on the Wild West frontier.